Let me take this opportunity to welcome all of you to this book launch. My name is Duma Gqubule. I'm Director of Executive Education at the Wits School of Governance. And I'm standing here simply because Professor Mazzucato, the head of the School of Governance, is not well and is not able to join us this evening. He just gave me an instruction to actually do the welcoming address. And he told me that I've got 30 minutes to say whatever I want to say. So I'm going to be brief. You are at the management campus of Wits University. This is where you find the Wits School of Governance, that's ourselves, together with the Wits Business School, who are our sister campus institution. And I'm responsible for executive education. So we train public servants and policymakers, including ministers, about how to manage government departments, but also the policy formulation process. So we offer short courses, and if you come on a normal day to this campus, you'll bump into ministers, DGs, mayors, senior officials of government from local, provincial, and also national departments. So it's a school of governance, and that's why we essentially here. I'm excited to be here this evening for the book launch on something that is very topical in the country. As you all know, we've just come out of the period that we call state capture, and part of what we are to deal with is basically the role of consulting companies during the period of state capture. I'm running a project in the school that's looking at the whole question of state capture, how it unfolded, and what were the conditions that enabled state capture to unfold and exist for almost a decade in our country. And part of the work that we're doing is to just begin to explore policy options that need to be looked at to make sure that we attend to the systemic and structural issues that contributed to state capture to exist in our country. So with these few words, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome our esteemed guest and author, Professor Mazzucato. Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening. I was impressed to see that you are accompanied by a women-only team, which is very impressive. I also want to take the opportunity to welcome Professor Busani Ngaweni, the principal of the National School of Governance, who are our partner as we work towards building the capacity of the public service, not just in this country, but in the continent as well. With these few words, I might as well just mention that in the briefing room, I told Professor here that we have an energy crisis in this country. And she thought I meant we don't have energy as individuals, but I meant we have an electricity problem in this country. So at about 6 o'clock, our turn for load shedding is going to come. So there may just be a disruption, but we'll keep the lights on. We've got emergency lighting here that will enable us to continue. The people who may miss out a little bit are those who are joining us online, but my technical team has assured me that, in fact, they'll actually be able to follow the proceedings. With those few words, I welcome you all. I'd like to now hand over to my old friend, Duma Gqubule, to actually take over and become our moderator for this evening. So thank you very much. You're all welcome.
Thank you very much. When Professor Ngaweni called me and asked me to moderate for the session, I thought after talking that I'm not qualified to do this. So I asked a friend of mine, Lerato, I said, Lerato, don't you think Kaya Sitole is better qualified than I am to moderate this? After all, he has been talking a lot in South Africa, activist against the shenanigans of the big four accounting firms and the consulting firms as well. So she sent me a picture of Kaya that's in Turkey at the Champions League final. So with a very pretty woman, then I decided, okay, I'm a Spurs supporter. Oh my God. So I decided, well, I should do it, but Kaya is here today. I'll ask him to make a few comments about this based on the work that he's done. Thank you very much. Professor Mariana Mazzucato is a rock star economist. She is the professor of economics of innovation and public. When she goes to countries, she goes and has coffee with the president. So I think yesterday I saw we had talking with the president for the different things that you're doing. And, South Africans want to know, does the president listen to you? You're a heterodox economist, an unorthodox economist, and everything he's doing is orthodox, So we want to know, does he really listen to you in the questions later on? Yeah, and people like you. Because there are some consultants, he must listen to people like yourself. So she was, I read, Professor was born in Italy. She grew up in the US. She studied at Tufts University, where she got an undergraduate degree, at the New College, where she got a master's degree and her PhD. And she's now the professor in the economics of innovation and public value at the University College of London, where she's founding director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And she's won many. She's done 4 books, The Entrepreneurial State. That's the first book that made public acclaim. The second one was called The Value of Everything. And then the third one is called The Mission Economy, The Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. You might remember that in South Africa, our leader of the official opposition came up with a moonshot pact. And the first thing I thought when he said that, had he read your book? Did he get it from there? Or what? Because, but anyway, or had he talked to you about this the political moonshot? And the final one is this one, The Big Con, how the consulting industry weakens our businesses, infantilizes our governments, and warps our economy. Before I asked her to do a very informal, my little experience in consulting has been quite, well, I'll just tell you one experience. In a previous life, I was the go-to person on the transformation of the mining industry. And, in the Zuma presidency, I was asked to, participate in something called Operation Pakisa, where we'd get all the stakeholders together in a room over months, and it was a lot of money. And then we would develop a strategy to transform our mining industry. Now, I knew a lot about this topic, more than most people. I'd been across different countries and how they've done their mining industry transformation. And then we came to the researchers conference, and there was McKinsey. I knew that this thing would never work because there was no universe in which McKinsey knew more about the issues than me and many of the people who were in the room knew about it. So thank you, Mariana. Maybe you can start talking.
So first of all, thank you so much to the leadership of the university. It's very appropriate, I think, to be having this discussion in the Wits School of Governance, because that's what we'll be talking about. How do we govern capitalism? And without the capacity within our public institutions, our private institutions, and especially without a good, ideally symbiotic, mutualistic, and not parasitic relationship between them, then we end up with a very problematic economy. And today we spent, I think, 4 hours here this morning with a workshop with Mizzou. He later felt too weak, so he had to go home, around the mission-oriented innovation network that my institute runs. And we're working closely with the Wits School of Governance. And that's all about sharing these governance challenges between public organizations that are actually trying to be creative, stepping outside of this little narrow box that economic theory has put the public sector in, as though at best it can fix a market. So that question of how do we shape an economy? How do we co-create business, civil society institutions, including labor unions, incredibly important. The type of capitalism, the type of economy we need, right? Because growth has not just a rate, but a direction. And we all want, ideally, a rate that's more inclusive, so less inequality, sustainable. What does that mean for how we govern business, institutions, so on and so forth? And that's really where the book begins, because it's a call out that we are weakening that capacity. We are infantilizing government. Now, that's not happening because the big bad consultants are doing that. To a large degree, what the book is about is governments wake up, start investing within your civil service. And the example you just gave is a really good example, because I should also say, as sort of a starting point, the book is not about consultants, right? There's plenty of consultants. Head teachers consult, nurses consult, doctors consult, academics that might have done research for 20 years on something. An oncologist will know about cancer and they might consult with a government that has a cancer strategy, which would include also prevention, right? Not just medicine. It's actually, the example you gave is where you thought that actually the government was bringing in the consulting industry that didn't even have the expertise in the area where they were consulting in. And this is what's really extraordinary. And, you know, this is a close to $1 trillion industry, 12 zeros globally. The big four, the big six, you know the names, PwC, Deloitte, Bain, McKinsey, KPMG. We look at the big consulting industry. So the big con, the big bit is the consulting industry whose business model itself is of conflicts of interest. The first conflict is the one that I kind of started out with. If you actually want to govern our capitalist system and our economies better, then surely if you're consulting with the government, and I'll get to the business side in a minute because consultants also consult for business, you want that government agency, department, or the Treasury, Department of Health to be stronger after the consulting, right? You want to increase their capacity. So ideally, they won't even need you in the next round. But if your business model relies on those contracts to constantly be renewed, there's actually very little incentive to increase that capacity. Second, there's huge conflicts of interest in terms of what might be called being on both sides of the street. You experienced it here, where you had a consulting company both consulting with ESCOM, state-owned enterprise, and the Treasury that in theory is supposed to be regulating ESCOM. Just recently, literally this month, a very similar conflict of interest was called out in Australia, where PwC not only has been accused of all sorts of tax scandals like Bain and Co. had here, helping your Zuma government actually reduce the strength of the tax authority. There, they were advising the government, PwC, on tax policy, and then the company how to avoid that same tax that they were advising on. But they also, similar to that both sides of the street with ESCOM, were found to be advising on medical prices for medical devices, which in Australia have both a private and a public price, and then the medical industry, the industry making those medical devices in the private sector about how to set those prices, right? So, I mean, these are just obvious conflicts of interest that should be illegal. So they are being called out increasingly in journalism, in the news. And what we try to do in the book is not do the journalistic side of it, even though we do have lots of these stories and they're all really incredible. They're, I would call crimes, scams, but also crimes. They should be seen as crimes. But we also ask why. Why is this happening, right? So we try to provide an analysis, and we say that the history of capitalism has been a history of consulting. So a lot of also the problematic policies and practices in business, so an over-financialized business sector, which, for example, uses, instead of reinvesting profits into the economy, might be using share buybacks in excess of what they should be using. Something like close to 10 trillion in the last decade has been used for share buybacks by the large corporates to boost share prices, stock options, and executive pay. Policies like that have been consulted in. And what's interesting is it's not that the consultants made up the policy. That comes from a whole, and I'm sure there's some business school students here, from kind of the ideology of shareholder value maximization. But often companies, when they implement policies like that, or downsizing policies when lots of workers might be fired, or mergers and acquisitions, but also the good stuff like ESG policies, having a rubber stamp, right, of Deloitte or McKinsey just makes it kind of go down the throat easier, the syrup going down the throat with a bit of sugar. So not owning up to, the kind of lack of courage to own up to those decisions as an outcome of management decision, and then having that debate within the company, with the shareholders, with the workers, and so it is God with a rubber stamp from Deloitte is itself a huge problem. But we really focus much more on government. But I did want to just mention that business side so we don't forget about it. We maybe can come back to it in the Q&A. But for me, this book was quite important because in the previous book that I wrote called Mission Economy, A Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism, I tell the story of one of the most difficult things that government has ever done. That was 52 years ago, putting a man on the moon, but it wasn't just on the moon, it was coming back, right? So to the moon and back in a short amount of time. That required strong capacity within government. So this was NASA, the National Space Agency. They needed to work with business. There was 400,000 people that got us to the moon and back. It was a strong direction, but it was mainly also by changing how they were doing policy, like procurement, which has been very important with COVID-19. Of course, we had to procure in personal protection equipment, vaccine. We can again talk about how that all went wrong, but still outcomes-oriented tools. NASA realized it needed that. It was a capacity, a capability. It was part of its governance structure. They also were very smart in how they worked with the private sector. They had to work with lots of different companies in nutrition, materials, electronics. It wasn't just aerospace, but they needed to know how to work with them. So they were also needed to have some confidence, right? They didn't want to get taken for a ride. So they put into the contracts, no excess profits. And today, excess profits should be ringing a bell because there's lots of excess profits being made in mining and minerals and energy, food prices, and so on. So they knew their role. And the guy who was actually in charge in NASA to do outcomes-oriented procurement, so which was a critical tool to catalyze all that bottom-up innovation that got us camera phones, software, baby formula, foil blankets along the way. These were the homework problems that had to be solved collectively. He noticed something. His name was Ernest Brackett. This is the 1960s. He said, we got a problem here. We're doing good work, but he was noticing there was a lot of outsourcing from the public sector to the private sector already then. McKinsey, by the way, was set up in 1920, so predates the Apollo program. And he said, if we continue to outsource to consultants, but also to the private sector, notice he didn't say we don't work with the private sector, but outsourcing their own capacity and capability to the private sector, he said, we will ultimately get captured, state capture, captured by brochuremanship. So they didn't have PowerPoints at the time. I purposely am not doing a PowerPoint tonight because it's late. We should all be drinking a nice glass of wine and relaxing and not watching some academic from far away do a PowerPoint. But, McKinsey and consultants come in with their fancy PowerPoints. They copy and paste them across countries. They didn't have them at the time. They had these nice brochures. He said, Ernest Brackett, head of procurement, we will get captured by brochuremanship. In other words, we won't even know which private sector companies to work with. If we don't have our own brain, if we're not capable, we don't have capacity, we won't know how to write the terms of reference. We won't know how to write the contracts. This guy was someone who knew how to write contracts, no excess profits, outcomes, challenge-oriented procurement. So that's one story, very important. So that's the brochuremanship story. Another story, fast forward, is what happened in the UK. During Brexit, forget that it was just one of the biggest mistakes ever for the country, forget what I think about it, but it required a lot of thinking of how to do it, or I could say not enough thinking, but still a lot of governance challenges. And government decided to basically outsource most of that governance to consultants. And their budget actually went up by 7 billion that year in 2016 and onwards. It kept going up by 10% a year because of these governance challenges they had with Brexit. And those numbers started to come out. I actually started calling them out already back in 2017. And then with COVID, similarly, instead of investing within the civil service to take on some of the most difficult challenges like the test and trace system, which was so important to know how the virus was spreading, they hired Deloitte to do test and trace. That was earning £1 million a day and failed miserably. There was a whole hearing about it that just called it one of the most incapable results. In other words, they didn't deliver what they needed to deliver. But the real question is, why would they have hired Deloitte, which had no experience, no expertise in test and trace, right? So in the UK government, for example, we have government digital services, which is actually a very well-known, we ourselves have done a case study on it, group of people within the cabinet office that actually came from the BBC iPlayer team with real kind of digital governance capacity. They weren't asked to kind of help out. Academics, even around digital governance, were not asked to help. Deloitte was hired to do test and trace. So there was a lord, a Tory lord, a conservative lord, who on the back of the Brexit sums and the COVID sums was like, what's going on? And so the subtitle, how the consulting industry is infantilizing our governments, comes from him. He said in 2020, if we continue to outsource our governance to the Deloittes, to the McKinseys, to the PwCs, we will infantilize Whitehall. In other words, we will turn our civil servants into babies, into infants. And what he meant, in fact, the whole quote, I have it somewhere, I have too many notes here, which I'm not even reading, but he said something like, civil servants enjoy working on the crunchiest problems of our time. That's also how they learn. And by infantilizing, he meant that they're not doing the learning. The learning by doing is not happening within government. So we all know that you wouldn't know how to ride a bike if you don't fall off and again, right? So if learning by doing is no longer happening within government, but somewhere else, and if that somewhere else is also kind of, a bit of a scam because what they're bringing to government isn't even kind of high level expertise, we have a problem. And again, backtrack again, where did all this come from? And it's interesting because the intuition would be that it came from kind of conservative governments. And it's true under Reagan and Thatcher, consulting spending went up. Under Thatcher, it went from 6 to 246 million during her reign. But actually what we found was that it increased, especially in the UK, for example, under the new Labour government of Tony Blair, not because he loved consultants, but because he didn't say the state should get out of the way. He said, no, of course we need the state. We're a Labour government, we're progressive, but without actually having a strong kind of theory and framing of what the state is for. So in the Institute, we talk about public purpose, public value. We try to define it. We try to push the frontier of that, try to develop a new theory of the public sector. If at best we say, no, the public sector is needed, but it needs to import kind of efficiency metrics, cost-benefit analysis, net present value, and it's seen as fixing a market failure versus this more proactive co-shaping, co-creating around public interest kind of metrics, then actually you end up needing consultants to come in and bring in these private sector metrics of, I would argue, static efficiency, cost-benefit analysis, and so on, into government. And also, if one of the points is to show that we're serious about governments and we're going to make it as efficient as the private sector, again, consultants find an open door. And in countries with weak government or weak state capacity, and I'm coming from Italy, so believe me, I know what it means to talk about state capture, corruption, weak state capacity, inertia, bureaucracy, and so on, then again, you end up with a catch-22. Because there's state capture, because there's corruption, because they're weak. And again, you end up with a catch-22. Because there's state capture, because there's corruption, because there's weak capacity, no one trusts government anymore, and we think it's got to come in from some sort of outside source. Not always consultants. In some countries, they over-rely, I would argue, with philanthropists, for example. And so, again, I think what will be really interesting in our discussion, and definitely in the audience, and let's make this as much of a discussion as possible, because I'd love to hear your own stories and views. I don't have all the answers. What does it mean then to rebuild that capacity? That's why I love working with Busani. I'm going to be at the National School of Government tomorrow, talking to the civil service through the kind of applied learning executive education program that we have in the Institute. Investing within the civil service is one of the first things that we talk about in the conclusion of the book. Because if this was just a call out of the tax evasion, the scams, the being on the both sides of the street, not having proper expertise at the table and so on, then it'd be like, all right, great, a bit depressing. But consulting was on the side. And the center was being done within Whitehall. Let's move on. Instead, what we try to do is to say, what's the solution? And one of the solutions is all the cabinet office, civil service, and so on. So one thing is to rethink how to rebalance that. It used to be that consultants were on the side, on the periphery. You had government trying to do good. So the learning by doing is truly being had inside and investing within our understanding of what it means to have a creative, agile, flexible, mission-oriented government. What do I mean by that? Government that actually is trying to go after difficult challenges like reducing the digital divide, having net zero in a region, vaccinating the whole population, vaccinating the whole world if we talk about multinational goals as opposed to what we ended up with, which was vaccine apartheid. Those difficult challenges need to be governed from within with help on the outside. So one thing is to rebalance that. Another thing is to make sure the contracts with consultants are transparent. So, when McKinsey was hired in Australia with $6 million worth of a contract to do their climate strategy, they were also consulting for 46 of the biggest fossil fuel companies in the world. You know, that's a problem. That should be known in the contract. If it's going to happen, it should be rendered explicit to know all the other types of contracts that a particular consultant is working for. The other thing is to embed learning. That point about, you know, if you had a therapist that had a client in therapy for their whole life, probably not a very good therapist, you know. Is there an end game? When does it stop? So making sure that contracts embed learning so that the actor that's hiring the consultancy is actually more capable, is better, is more healthy, is more able to work on that governance challenge in the next round, and it doesn't become an addiction, that like never ending, right? Because that's the problem, that like never ending contracting on the outside, which then causes that problem of weak capacity. So, you know, this would be a good moment to turn, you know, the conversation over. But I think asking why is it happening, where is it happening, how is it happening, and how can reverse this vicious cycle, and also not just blaming the consultants, because it's obviously not just their fault, but really asking government, how can it be that we have gotten ourselves into this trap? And just one last thing on the why. When I mentioned that, you know, this catch-22, the more we think that at best government can fix market failures, the more it will always be always kind of too little too late, in patching up mode, in filling the gap mode, and never kind of on top of the game. And so that's why in our own work in the Institute, or my work, I talk about market shaping and co-creation, but that doesn't mean government from above, you know, because that itself is a problem. What are the metrics that should hold governments accountable? That itself is a capability. But one of the issues that arises with market fixing is that there tends to be this risk averseness then within government, because this idea that the market is out there, you're there just to fix it, and you take up this little space, which public choice theory, new public management has basically also trained civil servants to believe, that government failure is even worse than market failure. Then there's this fear of stepping out of place, right? Of stepping out of your boundaries, because you might crowd out business. And what's super interesting, you know, because we do a lot of case studies on public organizations, those that have been most able and capable and creative to work with the private sector on difficult challenges were ones that weren't fearful, that actually welcomed uncertainty, welcomed risk, weren't just de-risking or facilitating the private sector. I always remind people that Kennedy said we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy. That means welcoming the uncertainty. But that means we actually have to create that space, because that's another proposal we make in the book. Safe places to screw up, basically. You could call it Gov Labs. They exist in the world. Chile has a Laboratorio de Gobierno. Like a safe place where you can experiment with something like outcomes-oriented procurement. And if we don't have that, that fear of making mistakes, you know, venture capitalists can brag about the mistakes. As soon as a civil servant makes a mistake, front page of the Daily Mail or whatever newspapers you have that like to bash government all the time, even though here the problem I know is different, but we'll get to that in a second. Then without making that change, then part of the reason why this has been happening is that government fear of or civil servants fear of taking those risks because they'll be blamed. It's easier to push the risk onto someone else. So that itself needs to be confronted head on. And all of this to say, in a country where, of course, again, I would come back to Italy and South Africa, have many, you know, different degrees of the problem, but we have very similar problems in terms of the history of corruption and state capture and problematic public-private relationships. We know that, and we should talk about that, but definitely the solution to that is not to say that we don't believe in government and someone else has to come in to solve the game.
Thank you so much, Mariana. You know, when you were talking about the therapist who wants to be your therapist forever, I was thinking, you know, I've had the same therapist forever.
Yeah?
And I always think of, no, I need to change and get someone else. And I end up with the same person. I don't have to explain the same things over and over again. So I don't know. So she's not a bad therapist. But anyway, so I just want to start the discussion with...
So he's a Tottenham supporter, and he's like Woody Allen.
So I just want to start with the good consultants, you know, because, and the bad consulting. For me, what stands out is that these consultants are legitimizing a certain problematic version of capitalism. Yeah. And they've become embedded in that version of capitalism. But I want to start with the good consultants. In your book, you talk about that guy after Allende, nationalized Chile. There was a good guy. He was a bit of a shady guy, but he ended up being a good consultant for the nationalized industries in Chile. Now, the reason I'm saying that is that, I come up with a lot of alternative heterodox. And first of all, I have to say is that a lot of people need to understand the scale of our problems in South Africa. Professor, we had a session at the National School of Government with Danny Roderick, and I was the respondent, and I just felt that he was talking about incremental stuff, and he was talking about, we need moonshot approaches to our development challenges. So when I start talking to people in public, and I convince them that, no, we have to do this and this and that, they say, okay, Duma, we agree with you, but not this government. So what I think is that what we need to do as a country, we need to innovate in terms of the institutions that we establish to be able to drive the moonshot missions that we have to develop. Because this public sector is totally discredited, but we have to do a lot of things. I just say the National Health Insurance Bill went through Parliament today. No South Africa, I believe in National Health Service, not even a National Health Insurance. But South Africans do not have trust in this public sector. We've got 3 public employment programs. We've got the Presidential Employment Stimulus, which the government is going to shut down in March, just 2 months before election. It's benefited 1.2 million people. I don't understand the logic of that. We've got the Community Works Program. We've also got the Expanded Public Works Program. These programs provide jobs to 1.8 million work opportunities and 900,000 full-time equivalent jobs. So the obvious thing is that we need to set up a new institution that has got public-private oversight. So I would like to think, what type of innovation can we do in terms of institutions? Can we set up a parallel government, not a parallel government, a temporary. A temporary.
Usani, tomorrow we'll talk about
public-private, like public-private, something that's neither public nor private. Like public or private.
Now I know why he's in therapy.
Can we have something that's in between this discredited state and something that's new? Can't we imagine? Roosevelt set up those alphabet agencies in the 30s to accelerate. And then lastly on this one, I just want to say, there's this friend of mine, he's the deputy mayor of Gqubule. And so he's very conservative. Mkhuseli Jack, and he said, so I talked to him a lot, and then I said, but Mkhuseli, for the stimulus that I believe in, why can't we give it to something like the Solidarity Fund, which is a response to COVID that we set up, and let's have solidarity funds in every province. How are you going to benefit? So everybody should bid for projects to create jobs and whatever. So how can we innovate in terms of the institutions? For me, that's very critical, while we fix this.
No, really good questions. Even if you're a Tottenham supporter, you're still very smart. So, one of the first things I learned from you, Busani, it was the first meeting we had. Well, the first and only live one, because then COVID struck. It was March 2020. And we were in Pretoria, and we were talking about government and capacity. And you said, Mariana, do you realize that one of the things, for example, that's happening here, but that you were talking about, that you were witnessing globally, is that we talk about the need to tackle these problems, and then we end up cutting. You talked about the National Statistics Authority. So the ability of government even to govern, the difficult, fast forward, infodemic side of COVID requires knowledge about data, of digital governance, coming back to my point about Deloitte getting the contract for test and trace. So we sometimes forget, especially on the left, when people talk about the problems with austerity, just cutting, that it's not about austerity as this big blob. It's actually the institutions that themselves have been decimated. In the UK, for example, money comes and goes. We've had governments that have reduced the public budget, those that have increased it. But what we've actually seen over the last 50 years is a weakening of the institutional capacity itself. We're seeing it today with the BBC, by the way. There's just by being constantly under attack, then it itself starts to shy away. It doesn't even kind of play its bold role that it used to play. So that kind of, where should this governance then happen? Do we need a parallel government or not? One of the things we try to do precisely in this Mission-Oriented Innovation Network, where we met today here at the School of Governance, but also in my institute in general, is to say we need to actually learn also from the positive stuff that's happening on the ground, even in quite problematic countries. Again, I would definitely not point to the UK today as good governance or good government, but there's still really interesting things happening at the institutional level. The question is, can we look at it with a microscope in the same way that, say, Harvard Business School looks at case studies on the private sector, and that case study methodology has been, is all over the world in terms of MBAs and business schools. I'm sure in your own business school you have a case study methodology. We haven't done proper case studies in the public sector. What works, what doesn't? And when it works, how do we scale it up? What are the lessons? What would it look like if the system actually worked that way? And that's why I'm really interested in things like outcomes-oriented procurement and understanding why the cost-plus model doesn't work and why it's open to gaming and capture more than the fixed price with incentives for innovation and quality improvement, why we then need to kind of sandbox that around social problems. Why is it that we only use outcomes-oriented procurement around the military-industrial complex problems or during COVID when millions of people are dying? What would it look like to do what Sweden does, for example? Forget Sweden as a country, I'm interested in the experiments, where they, at a high level, said we want a fossil-free welfare state, but then they bring it down to the everyday. So school lunches in Sweden have to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. Lunch becomes the moonshot. And because it's seen in this kind of bold way, that's why it then needs lots of different sectors to interact in a new way, why the government has to interact in a new way with small, medium enterprises that are procuring in healthy, tasty, sustainable food. You can get kids in the schools to participate in the design of the lunches. They can learn about it through the curriculum, so that issue also participatory governance can be learned a bit from an experiment like that. But that might sound like a tiny little who cares, but it's only by sandboxing and learning what did it look like to procure in food for free school meals with an innovation lens, so it becomes part of your innovation budget, right, on everything we do, as opposed to seeing innovation just on one side of the economy and the rest of government just being a bit of a basket case. Another example in the UK that I learned from, that we did a case study, as I mentioned, GDS. GDS was set up by this iPlayer team, where the first thing they did was to say, let's stop talking about people in the country as though they're just clients and customers. People as customers in a hospital,
What's
clients
GDS
in a
again?
school, government digital services.
Okay.
They said people need to use a digital platform by government, and we need to increase the user experience, so it's fulfilling when you're getting your passport, your driver's license, your voting registration, as opposed to wanting to shoot yourself because the forms take forever. And with a human rights perspective, they ended up winning an international design award because it was so innovative. And it was also potentially, it didn't then happen, so also learning from the failures are important, going to help the different departments work interministerially. Because anytime you have an outcomes orientation around, say, net zero or well-being, it can't be for one ministry. Climate is not just for the Department of Energy. Well-being is not just for the Department of Health. Having that those different ministries working together and having a platform, a digital platform that allows data sharing and so on, was their goal. So I do think that we need to look also where government works, these interesting examples, and then learn both between governments but within government. But the problem is, if we give up on government, if we just see the corruption, if we just talk about the nepotism, the state capture, the positive goal of actually improving that state capacity through a revolutionary and radical program of investment within civil service, perhaps that can come from the outside. I'm not saying our institute, but anyway, through the National School of Government, through the Wits School of Governance, bringing in a really bold new curricula that's outside of the status quo. I actually think that's one of the best places to begin, and be as radical as you can.
Yeah, so now let's say I'm the president and I give you a brief. We've got these 3 public employment programs, 1.8 million work opportunities, 900,000. Let's do a moonshot. Our big problem is unemployment. We've got 11.9 million unemployed people, 42% unemployment rate. We've got 47% with Africans, 51% African females. That is a catastrophe.
Yeah.
So we need to innovate in terms of setting up jobs for people. Yeah. So how would you transform this thing from where it is now, paying very low wages, towards 5 times the size that it is now, to provide 5 million full-time jobs for some. So those are the type of initiatives we don't have time in South Africa for incremental changes.
Yeah.
What can we learn from your experience?
Exactly, and those are some of the cases we've been looking at, and I'm going to use a word that sometimes is seen as problematic because it makes us think of a different word. But anyway, conditionalities, right? So the government alone is not going to change the employment problem. Business alone is not going to change the employment problem, especially when we have inertial business. You know, you've been focusing a bit on the government side, but we know South Africa, like many countries, also has very problematic businesses. Just look at, just a little detour here, if you're interested in some interesting work on this, Gabriel Palma, Chilean economist at University of Cambridge, has shown that inequality is at one of the highest levels in South Africa due to very extractive business practices, an ultra-financialized type of corporate governance. And he looks at a different type of inequality index. It's not the Gini ratio, but a ratio that looks at the difference between the top 10% and the middle 40%, and he uses that and looks at the relationship between that and the profits and the wealth that's extracted out of the country instead of reinvested back in. Anyway, what can be done? The idea behind a mission-oriented government, an outcomes-oriented government that's really trying to change the relationship also with business means that all the different levers, I've talked about procurement, but think of loans, grants, bailout schemes, can actually embody within them the goal of where you're trying to go, in the same way that the NASA procurement, you know, had those no excess profits and that kind of outcomes orientation. An example would be, in recent years, the KfW, which is Germany's public bank, when it provided a loan to the steel sector, which is seen as an old-fashioned sector that is also very carbon emitting. It's part of the problem in the country in terms of pollution. You know, we can think of some parallels with the mining sector here in terms of how, you know, you can't just have an immediate transition away from it, but the sector has to transform. The bank, so it's a public bank, put conditions attached to the loan that steel had to reduce its material content in order to access the loan. To do that, they had to invest, they had to innovate, they had to retrain the workforce. They ended up using repurpose, reuse, recycle technology across the whole supply chain. Today they have the greenest steel in the world that's also increasing employment, because to green something, it doesn't happen just by talking about green, you have to invest in the training. Another example is in the US, which in the past, the United States had a problematic way that the public sector worked with the private sector. I wrote about it in The Entrepreneurial State, where I said everything in your iPhone was state funded, internet, GPS, touchscreen, and Siri, but there was no kind of proper conditionality attached in terms of the reward sharing, so we ended up socializing the risks and privatizing the reward. This year, the CHIPS Act, which you might know as part of the Biden recovery program, has tried to, in order to address the US version of the problem, in terms of stagnant wages, in terms of financialization, which is a huge problem in the US, they embodied within the CHIPS Act, and this stuff, by the way, happens right away. You don't have to wait, right? Because the investments are being made now. Conditionality that was good for workers. So $400 billion being given basically to the semiconductor industry because they're worried about not being sovereign in terms of their chips production. It's almost all being made in Asia. But the companies benefiting have to invest in better working conditions, invest in higher wages, train the workforce, use energy efficient technology, limit share buybacks, so invest the profits being made back into production instead of extracted out through share buybacks. So in South Africa, you can tell me what examples of that would look like. So, you know, obviously there's a whole debate about what to do with mining. You can't just stop right away. There's a transition. We were talking about that in the discussion with the South African colleagues, but what would it mean to actually repurpose some of the subsidies to make sure that the sector itself becomes part of the solution, not part of the problem, in terms of how loans, guarantees, subsidies, and so on. But also, you know, that's the public-private. There's also public-public. New relationship between Eskom, for example, one of your state-owned enterprises, and the Treasury, right? That kind of new conditionality that actually embeds within that interface between public and private. But coming back to the book, all of that requires capacity, capability, experimentation, a symbiotic, not a parasitic predator-prey relationship between business and government. How to do that, we can learn around the world. I gave you a couple examples, and it's that learning that I think is really important for the Wits School of Governance, for the National School of Governance, and for any sort of civil service reform, how not to go back to the old way of thinking. It's either the state, big state that does everything, or we just give up on the state, it's all going to be private sector led. how do we govern, right, these challenges in such a way to direct an economy where the interface, whether it's an intellectual property right, whether it's an innovation collaboration, whether it's a public loan program, a grants program, a guarantee program, a COVID bailout program, it's helping to steer the economy to produce more employment, better employment, and more green. In France, for example, the French finance minister, just, again, these examples are all just there to learn from. The French finance minister, during COVID, when companies needed immediate help, put conditions attached. Renault and Air France had to commit to reducing their carbon emissions to get 1 penny out of the government. In the UK, 600 million to EasyJet, no conditions attached. That's a parasitic relationship. And when I say parasitic, I'm not just saying it as a bad word, I'm using biology metaphors, because the biologists, when they look at an ecosystem, will always differentiate whether it's a parasitic or symbiotic ecosystem.
Yes, just my last question, just first a comment. Back in the day, I saw a comment in the book about this UK civil servant who talked about a government consultancy. So I remember back in the day, I was talking to the finance, he wasn't the finance minister now. I said, but now why don't we set up a 50-50 government in-house consulting company?
Yeah.
There's many unemployed DGs and so forth.
Yeah.
Why don't you set up and use this expertise and do in-house consulting for your ESCOM, for Transnet?
Yeah.
And then I had a friend from McKinsey, and I also asked him, you know, the ANC, they just get this deployment wrong. He was working for Toby Puting, the late one. And I said, but now why don't we just do the 50-50 with the government and we handle this deployment for them? But anyway, my point is now the bad consulting. The bad consulting. The consultants have become embedded in this problematic model of capitalism. They have destroyed the capacity of the state, and then they come back to fix the capacity of the state. My experience, I worked in the Department of Transport before state capture. And after apartheid, there's a minister. There was one integrated department. Then they decided to create 15 agencies. And then they cut the Department of Transport. And then they cut the number of people who worked there. So when I was now working there, I was reporting to a 29-year-old Oxford Rhodes Scholar, one of the best people I've ever worked with. She was 29 years old. And then we couldn't get hold of her, me and my colleague I was working with. She says, Duma, the problem is, we now have to hire, I think, 1,000 people, and we're in job interviews the whole day. Nothing happens in this department,
Yeah.
And so they destroy, and then they set up, and that, when you come to state capture, so what I'm saying is that the capacity started being decimated long ago.
Yeah.
And then fast forward to today, our government is still on the same playbook. Structural reforms, my favorite topic, yeah. Everything hinges on structural reforms. This is the withdrawal of the state from energy, transport, water, and what's the other one? Communications, yeah. So now, if you add up all these structural reforms, you're on the President's Advisory Council, if you add them all up, they do not add up to much.
Yeah.
And you are further reducing the capacity of the state, and what logic is there in that, Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think you answered your own question, but you're absolutely right. And we give many examples in the book, and one is exactly, it's exactly what you said, where you had all these civil servants during COVID just facing these massive challenges, and they said that they just had to waste so much time answering what they called zombie emails from these 30-year-old Deloitters who didn't know what they were doing, or just sending them messages asking for basic information on how the government was, the department was run. I have very good friends. I mean, in the book we talk a lot, we refer to interviews we undertook with people, mainly young people that we know who are working in consulting companies, and they're not bad people. These are all actually often from the top universities. We talk about the talent drain, where the consultants actually purposefully go to some of the best named universities in the U.S. They would be the Ivy League, the Russell Group universities in the UK, and your best universities. But the striking thing is they might be smart students, but they often, again, don't have any knowledge of that particular area, also with the private sector. So I had a friend at Princeton who graduated with top grades in medieval literature. and she ended up advising IBM on its value chains first year out. I was like, dude, you do not know anything about that, right? Like, just admit it, nothing. And so there is that kind of, aura, and we talk about that in terms of consultology, like Scientology. But the point is not to say that consultants are dumb or the industry is terrible. This idea that actually consulting and advising has always been important. No one actor will always know everything. And this point about actually having an in-house consultancy organization is actually picking up. In Germany, they have something called the PD, which is an in-house consultancy. But it doesn't have to happen that way. It could also happen through, as I mentioned, Gov Labs, safe places within governments where they explicitly take time every month to experiment, and they're rewarded for the risk-taking, the experimentation, the trial and error, the learning by doing, all the things that we, look at in the private sector as a good thing. I often, talk about how in MBA courses, if you just look at the names of the courses, they're really cool, like strategic management, decision sciences, organizational behavior. They have textbooks called Rejuvenating the Mature Corporation. Why? Because when corporations get mature and large, they get inertial. They get a bit bureaucratic. Whereas when government gets bureaucratic, we roll our eyes and say Kafkaesque bureaucracy, as though it's in the DNA of government to always be terribly boring and bureaucratic and inertial. We've actually made it that way, and so what does it mean to actually think about creative bureaucracies? We actually have a module in our MPA on that. So I don't want to underestimate the need to actually change the training, change the curriculum, but also then experiment with this new way of doing government, looking at cases where it's worked and asking what does it mean to scale. And especially in your own country, I mean, is everything terrible? Or, where are the examples? I mean, you, when you were initially still in peak, the President's Economic Advisory Committee, we also looked at, stuff that was working. The problem is it just remained this tiny little thing on the side. So, that's the question. Instead of setting up a parallel government or bringing in the philanthropists, the Gates Foundation to solve all the health problems, which, by the way, they themselves are characterized by huge problems in terms of how they think about intellectual property rights. Democratizing government has to begin with rethinking its governance structures, and your question about institutional redesign is a great way to begin. And I do think examples like how do you make a public loan program conditional on the companies being good for people and planet, being good for workers, better working conditions, better pay as part of the government program, but not too top down, because then that could be accused of micromanaging and stifling innovation, but a strong direction with conditions, leaving lots of room for the how. That's how we got to the moon.
Yes. When you're talking about the good consultant, I was thinking my sister was a good consultant at Deloitte Consulting. So she was a partner there, and I called her before I came to talk to her. She says, I agree with her. Anyway, I want to open it up. Kaya, I can't see you. Oh, here you are. Yeah. I want Kaya to say a few words first, a comment and a question. For those who don't know who Kaya is, he is one of the activists against the shenanigans of the consulting companies and the Big Four. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. The Champions League ended on Saturday, so I'm back. So Professor, thank you very much for that. And I think obviously my particular level of interest in the book is based on what I've been trying to research here in South Africa in particular. And I think what has become quite clear over the years is that the practice that was obviously quite universal in nature of the reliance on consultants has really become quite embedded in the South African state. Yeah. And the problem that we've then seen is that it has not only led to a state paralysis where internal capacity has not been built in, but also it's become quite clear that we're now essentially operating a formal parallel state. Yeah. So as recently as last week, the Auditor General released one of her harrowing reports, not because they're badly written, but because they tell us a bad story of the country. And what we've seen in particular in relation to how the financial statements of public entities are prepared is that there is a dependency, not just a reliance, a dependency on outsiders to do that. And that simply means that internally these institutions, whether they're municipalities or other arms of the state, they do not have the internal capacity to do this, so then they outsource it. Yeah. So firstly, that obviously comes at an enormous cost because we pay the people that have been paid to do the job, and then we pay the people that they pay to do the job on their behalf. Yeah. But also quite important importantly, we've then entered into an accountability vacuum where I can essentially get hired to come and prepare those financial statements, but I do not work for the state. I'm not accountable to the municipal council. I'm not accountable to any to parliament at all. So in fact, what you will see is that a lot of these organizations, they go and present the work that they haven't done themselves. And for me, I've been paid and then I walk away. So we've got that emerging accountability vacuum that has become quite problematic in South Africa. And I think when we do talk about this formal parallel state, it's the fact that in every single year, these institutions aren't necessarily getting better at doing things within. They simply know that the next year they're going to go and call these consultants.
Exactly.
And the reason that matters in particular is that they are obviously within the spectrum of government activities or any state entity. There are things that are so fundamental in their mandate, they should be done internal because it doesn't make sense to outsource them.
Exactly.
So the distinction between the ad hoc services that may occasionally require the intervention of outsiders versus the permanent work flow has not been made very clear. And so what we're seeing here is that we're actually spending a lot of money essentially running this parallel state. So that's the first part that we've seen. But what has also become quite problematic for me in the South African context is the fact that even in instances where we've then called out these consultancies for the work that they've done, where we've then seen how they've misbehaved themselves, even criminal conduct is not an impediment to them getting additional business.
Yeah.
So of the case studies that I've looked at, there's actually been McKinsey and the 3 case studies and the Deloitte one. So in short, in the McKinsey case study, I've actually looked at 3 particular instances. The first one is an ongoing court case involving a guy called Abdulaziz who actually lives in Canada. So what happened with Abdulaziz is that a few years ago, Mohammed bin Salman wanted to do something in relation to running the public finances of Saudi Arabia. And then he formed the view that there were some dissidents who kept challenging him on social media. So he actually employed McKinsey to sort of do some analysis and research on who these people were. So McKinsey then prepares a 9-page slide deck and they say these are the 3 individuals who are the most vocal against the Saudi government. And of those 3 individuals, Abdulaziz was one of them. So the next thing that they did on the basis of the McKinsey report is that they got someone from Twitter working internally to then actually hack into the messages of Abdulaziz to find out who he was talking to. And it was in hacking those messages that they then identified that he had been supported by another guy who was based in the United States. And that guy had actually given him a $5,000 grant to actually help him with some of the work. So what they then did is that they then tried to track down that guy who had been supporting Abdulaziz. And when they tracked down that guy, they then eventually invited him to visit an embassy in Turkey, in Istanbul, where I was last week. And that guy was Jamal Khashoggi. So McKinsey was actually complicit in his murder. The second issue that then happened was that when it came to the opioid crisis.
Have you written about that?
Yes, I've actually been downloading the article. I sent it to you
You
earlier.
sound like-
Yeah, I sent it to you earlier.
I was in the car, yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
that should be front page news of.
Yeah, and the second case that I've also looked at was what McKinsey did in relation to the opioid crisis in the United States. So again, what then happened here is that there was this company, Purdue Pharmaceuticals. They were in the drug manufacturing industry, and then they came to McKinsey and then they said, look, we want to scale up our business. What should we do? And McKinsey actually then prepared a PowerPoint presentation. It's 12 pages of a horror show. And in those 12 pages, McKinsey is very clear that, well, actually, one of the best ways in which you can actually improve your profitability is to create an additional drug dependency from these patients. So there were 2 types of patients that they identified. People who use these drugs once a month, for example, the profit margins were XYZ. But if you can get these people to use the drugs more frequently, the profit margins become 450%. So what McKinsey then recommended is that in order for you to get the higher profit margins, you need to come with incentive schemes for the doctors to promote the use of the drugs, so they escalated the dependency. At this stage, 450,000 Americans have died from what McKinsey did with Purdue Pharmaceuticals. And the problem is that they are still in business. In the South African context, when it came to Eskom, we do know what obviously they did when it came to Eskom and their transactions with Trillion. But even then, what they did is that they simply paid back the 1.87 billion rand, and South African businesses are still using them. So the reason that all matters is that even if one had to actually identify that these organizations are actually not only facilitating the paralysis of the state in the work that they do, they may say they're doing the best that they can, but also even when they migrate over to criminality, the states have become so paralyzed, they actually still go back to them. And the most obvious case of what we've seen in South Africa was the Deloitte case, where during the state capture years, Deloitte, like everybody else in the big 7 that you mentioned in the book, then entered into consultancy contracts with Eskom. And when those consultancy contracts were found to be problematic, Eskom then said that they're going to sue Deloitte. And they were going to, I think they were asking for about 200 million rand in repayments. And then Deloitte said, we're going to, challenge this, and then we're going to fight back. And then about 18 months later, once a guy called Sikonati and a guy called Andrew Derrida were running Eskom, they then come up with this story that, oh, they've reached a settlement with Deloitte. So I called up and I said, but how did you reach a settlement with Deloitte? You said this was the case. You had sent me the papers and I could see that this was a case that actually meant Deloitte had a case to answer. And they simply said, well, actually it turns out that there was a risk that we could lose, so therefore we didn't challenge it. So they reached a settlement with Deloitte. But it turns out that that was actually a lie. So what Deloitte had done is that they entered into this contract in their capacity as the consulting wing of Deloitte. So what then happened is that Eskom then started looking for the auditors of Eskom. And then all the other big firms didn't want to take it, and Deloitte wanted to bid for that contract. But since you're suing us on the one side, we sort of can't bid for this one. So that settlement then opened up the way for Deloitte to become the current auditors of Eskom today.
Wow.
So in South Africa, even criminal conduct, even criminal complicity is not sufficient as a barrier for these entities to actually run the state. Yeah. And the reality here is that for as long as the state has been as incapacitated as it has been, even an entity like Eskom will say, look, we still needed to be audited, so therefore we're happy to go back to Deloitte. And the question was, well, actually, isn't there a state agency that is supposed to be auditing you? And that's the Auditor General. And of course, the Auditor General doesn't have the capacity to audit Eskom. So we've seen the proliferation of that. It's actually created this informal parallel state. It's created the paralysis within the state bureaucracy, which simply means that in South Africa, unfortunately, we are going to be stuck with these consultancies for a very long time. It doesn't matter how many people they kill the day after. Thank you.
It's like the dependency on the drug dealer.
Yep.
You should write the book, a book. That's extraordinary. I mean, that's, what we do in the book is we try to actually say, and we list a lot of the different scandals, including the opioid crisis, which they completely turbocharged, and then just paid a fine, but then continue to get the contracts later. And so both that secrecy, but that damage to democracy, and as you say, a parallel state. It's interesting that you began by saying, do we need a parallel state? Well, you've got a parallel state. And yet so much of the focus continues to be on governments and all their failures without actually looking at the fact that actually government is not governing. Right? I mean, like, where are these decisions being made? Do citizens who vote know that actually then the key decisions, because you were very, incisive when you said, what is being consulted? Is it something peripheral or the central? My point before, that it's fine to have some consulting as long as it's on the side. When you're consulting on the key areas that governments should be governing in order for them to even be considered a democracy, it's no longer democracy, even if the consultants are not committing the crimes, right? It's just that lack of accountability. On top of that, creating, adding these crime stories, it's just actually extraordinary that it's being not only allowed, but just how little attention it's getting. And my own experience is really interesting, actually. So, these 4 books I've written, this is the book that I'm getting the most backlash on, like not being invited to certain book festivals. And, I could just call them out. I got a call from Aspen Ideas saying where I was supposed to go in June. I think I was supposed to go this week. So I'm here, I'm not at Aspen Ideas. And they said, oh, we have a bit of a problem. Would you mind maybe presenting your previous book instead? I was like, no, this book just came out. I'm on a book tour. I'm presenting this book. I said, well, one of our sponsors is Deloitte. And we just think it would be a bit awkward, or Deloitte thinks it would be a bit awkward. I was like, oh, okay. Well, not only am I not coming this year, I'm never coming again, because I thought you were Aspen Ideas, And then in another case, this is all whatever, a bit random, but I was told that one of the leaders of one of the most famous consulting companies, I won't name it because I don't have proof, said, we will make sure she never speaks at any of the big conferences again. They are also sponsor of TED. So this message, and the message you just gave, which was incredibly stark, and I hope you're going to write it up as eloquently as you just gave it, is gets a lot of backlash, and there's so much vested interests in not only telling the story, but the governments themselves that are working in bed with the consultants won't necessarily want that story out because it just makes them look incredibly bad, as though they really don't know what they're doing. So please, thank you, first of all. I want to congratulate you for that investigative work.
Uta, do you want to say something? Okay, anyone has some comments? Donovan. He used to work for the National School of Governance
It's a very, very long time ago.
and the Department of Public Service.
I was going to introduce myself as one of the few remaining ANC supporters and members, possibly in the planet, but you've decided to give me other titles. It's very similar to what Kaya has raised, in a sense, you know, that when I think of consultants, I put it under the rubric of outsourcing. And the idea that the state or government, to be more particular, mustn't really be in anything operational, must just create this environment. And therefore should not build houses, but should contract companies to build houses. And I recall when I first got to Johannesburg that, and I worked for the South African National Civic Organization, we were being helped by this management consulting company called Booz Allen. And the then city manager of Johannesburg, when we said Booz Allen, he said, "Oh, the CIA guys." And we went like, "Whoa, hold on, what do you mean the CIA guys?" And then I saw Booz Allen sponsoring a golf tournament that Tiger Woods is in, and I said, "These guys are big." And then when I read The Economic Hitman, and then thereafter Athol Williams' Deep Collusion, where he couldn't make the link between working for Bain and working for a CIA front. Working for Deloitte, which were the consultants to how the South African process in parliament should take place in the new South Africa, as well as the Kremlin after the Soviet Union in Russia, that all these companies that we outsource and call them consultants are really companies embedded in their own collusion, in their own state in the West, between the elite of capital with the elite of the political elite class. And the consultants play that role. And in our country, and I'm sure many here, the students, as they try to find jobs, and not all can become lecturers, will also have to become consultants in Deloitte and Touche and wherever else, Ernst & Young and PwC and Booz Allen in another form, Bain in another form, etc. And they wouldn't like to think they overthrew Iran or Guatemala. But in essence, I still go back to this, but who hires the consultants? I mean, like, the consultants don't just come and force themselves. And so I think the NSG and Wits PNDM have got a lot to answer for. Yeah, okay, Wits School of Governance. They have a lot to answer for because if you go with just NSG certificates and apply for a job in the NSG won't hire you. They will hire people with a certificate from Wits. And then if you look at what is being taught in Wits and what is a public servant, will be the theory of public service, of what's public administration, but not really how to be a public servant. It fits in this idea, and their whole process in government is how to do submissions and how to do tenders, which is outsourcing. Government is set up to outsource. So consultants are just on the other side of it because there's the markets there. And it's quite worrying because if you look at it, and why? And you'll have how many people in government getting bursaries from government to study MBAs, because you can't go higher up in government if you don't have no idea how to create public servants. And that Duma raised the issue of ESCOM, Transnet, etc. All of that is part of, should be government, but it's taken away from that.
Yeah.
And this is at the heart, one of the biggest things of state capture,
was the outsourcing of the social welfare grants. And what happened was that government set up an agency. So the Department of Social Welfare set up an agency so that they could give social grants. And the agency put up, which was the same size, if not bigger than the actual Department of Social Welfare, set up a tender so that somebody else can pay the grants. So that's what they were set up for. They were going to outsource. And when ABSA, which is basically Barclays, was supposed to get the tender, when they weren't getting the tender, because the minister was not very well liked, then is Batabile Dlamini, who I think just yesterday, she was told she has to pay back legal fees. She said, no, but hold on, why are we outsourcing this? Why are we using consultants to tell us that ABSA must do this? Let's set up work streams, 5 work streams. But she wasn't very popular.
No, I get it, Jonathan. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. She was not very popular. Yeah. So the thing is this, is that in our government,
we keep giving these people.
And in our media and in our schools, we essentially push this position that you need bright people like consultants to tell you what to do. And if they don't tell you how to do it, it's not good enough.
Thanks.
That's why you need these other, no, I'm sorry, Duma. That's why you need these other things. So the con is not just the consultants. The con is the schools, as you were saying it, the media, and the private sector. Yeah. It's a nice shell game.
That's why in the book, we purposefully actually start out with all those points. We say this will never be solved if we don't rethink what government is for, what public purpose is for, what the civil service is for. And as long as at best it's about fixing market failures. And we have a whole chapter on, are you listening? Just kidding. Yeah. Exactly the words you said, steering but not rowing. Yeah. Then if you're not rowing, if you're not doing, you won't even know how to steer. And if you do steer all of a sudden, what are you steering for? So the reason I like to talk about the moon landing is because there was a clear goal. And when government worked with the private sector came in to help government on a goal set by the public sector. What happened in the UK with the PFI schemes, the private financing initiatives, which were all consulted in as well. It was not just outsourcing to the private sector, but the very contracts themselves were consulted by consultants. There was, public and private working together, public-private partnership, but on what? On eventually a healthcare system that was basically, even if it wasn't privatized, it was still funded by the public sector, but defined by the private sector. So, that kind of steering, not rowing, kind of ideology, market fixing, not market shaping, unless we really start with that. And that's why, thank you for making the point as you made it. This problem will not go away. We need to rethink, what is the civil service for? What is the state for? And then hold the state accountable to that. It's not about glorifying the state. The state will have a much harder time if we get good at doing that in terms of actually proving it's doing good for people. I think we had a question.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Mohammed Lokat. I'm a researcher at Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, a research consultancy in Pretoria. But I'm speaking in my
personal capacity.
In my personal capacity. And I think that the discussion today was quite interesting. Thank you, Mariana and Duma. But I think we need to add more color to it and to be quite frank with our assumptions and framing in this. And I'll start off by sharing a personal story. Upon leaving university, I interviewed with a management consultancy in Cape Town.
What?
And it was a series of 5 interviews, right? They take you through quite a strenuous process. And in one of the interviews, we had to do a case study regarding formalizing the minibus taxi industry. And my question was initially, why isn't government doing this? And secondly, I asked the interviewers, have you guys ever sat in a minibus taxi in your lives? And both of them answered no. So as a young South African, what hope does this give me that one of the most functionally capacitated municipalities in our country resolves to implementing quite disastrous policies on the basis of consultancies? So from that story, the questions I'd like to ask, and it's quite hard to follow after Kaya and Donovan here, is that we need to be quite honest with ourselves. And the assumption and the framing in this conversation was the state needs to be capacitated, or the state resorts to consultants. We have to ask ourselves in the South African context, why is this? And the answers are quite well ventilated. I'll just name a few. It's because of the patronage networks that have been formed. It's because of cadre deployment. It's because of the lack of growth that civil servants see themselves, the lack of productivity in civil servants. It's because of the government being in bed with big businesses, resulting in a concentration in our economy. It's because we don't have a civil service that's separated from the political, and therefore resulting in no capability. How do we build up this capability, and why does it lead us to resolve to the state requiring consultants to formulate RFPs as a base level, to do their IDPs, to formulate their annual financial statements, as Kai says? And I think the framing to change. Duma, you mentioned they destroy, and I think that's quite mistaken in my opinion, right? The state or consultants didn't destroy ESCOM. The state destroyed it itself. Same for Transnet and so on. So when the state retreats from these areas, it's not because of some insidious or some sort of agenda that's going on. It's because the state itself failed its constitutional mandate and broader societal mandate. So therefore, we need to, as I said, we need to change that sort of framing. The second question, I'm going to be quite frank about this, is we need to look at our own positionality in these areas. We can't be talking from one side of the mark, but acting on the other side of the mark. And Mariana, I'm going to call you out directly on this. Acting in terms of the Presidential Economic Advisory Council does form a part of being a consultant. Duma, you as well, that's a consultancy. The Wits School of Government. Duma, you talked about acting for presidential employment stimulus. What is this? It's a consultancy. You're going to get paid extortionate amounts of money.
We didn't get a penny.
I believe
It's an example.
Yeah.
It's an example. Even the NGO space in this country extracts rents from the government that are quite extortionate. And as I mentioned, while you laughed initially, I'm part of this, so I'm in the position to call it out. So, Mariana, you mentioned in the book that if it forms part of the core considerations of government that's inimitable to the functions of democracy, then it's a problem. I'd say it takes it a step further. It's still a form of parasitism, where there are capacitated civil servants in this country, but we still need to rely on consultants and overseas institutions. We need to think about the positionality of universities, because the trend that I've seen in the recent past is that universities are trying to tread that fine line between being in the private sector and being in the public sector, consulting for large corporates, but also acting as if we are still a sort of academic institution, So basically, South Africa is not the US. We need to be aware of our positionality. And yeah, we need to solve this issue of state capacity, but it's not going to come through us here in this echo chamber. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Just a few comments online. There's some fangirl comments, but fanboy comments. No questions yet, but I've been following a few of Mariana Mazzucato's writings, and I love how refreshing her views on governance are.
That's an easy.
Eager to hear from the great economists. And then Professor Tuli Madonsela, why do Africans, she's the former public protector, yeah? Why do
former public what?
Protector, yeah.
Protector.
The other one was having a press conference today. So she's the one who wrote the first state capture report, which I actually think was probably one of the great reports that I read from page to page, yeah. So why do African governments tend to trust local whites, Europe and the US, for answers to their human well-being and economic challenges? And why are they willing to accept copy and paste solutions from elsewhere and without interrogating vision match? Good news, Cadogan, who is a consultant. Good news. And you can see from the answer, the question, how would we create a framework for consultant monitoring and evaluation?
On your comments, which were super useful, That is the point of the book. The state has failed. And when we look at the history of consulting, it's the history of capitalism, we look at state failure over the last 50 years. That's why it's not just about money coming and going pro or against austerity, but the slow decimation of state institutions, the remit of the state. I don't know if you've read the book, Ill Fares the Land by Tony Judt. He says that, even though people kind of focused on Reagan and Thatcher in terms of money, what actually happened was the vocabulary, the narrative during those years changed of what the state was for. And he looks at the words, like all of a sudden, you don't even have like ministries and departments, you have administration, the state as administrator. In the book, we talk about that kind of framing of the state, again, at best as fixing market failures and no longer building houses, but just kind of potentially governing privately set kind of housing strategies. So it's that the consulting companies then benefit from a failed state, and that's the problem. So your second point about aren't we all in the end consultants? First of all, just in peak at least, we didn't earn a penny. You're right though. Why does the maybe president even need some sort of council committee, regardless of whether they're paid or not? That's not the point of the book. I began with that. This is not a book against advising. Consulting since the medieval ages, the kings, the queens might have had consultants. Is that really the point? That's kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I started with the point about if a government has a cancer mission, it'd be crazy not to call in the top oncologists in South Africa to come in. Why should they work for free, right? Pay them the right wage, whatever it might be, to help the government learn, which then it can do better its policy around cancer. That's a very different type of consulting because there's value being brought in by someone, a woman, a man, an organization that has actually developed that expertise that then can help the government. What we look at in the big consulting industries, that the business model itself has nothing to do with even developing that expertise that then they are bringing in. The example of Australia was quite striking because they had themselves invested in kind of an internal, not so much consulting, but agency called CSIRO, which we talked about today, which has some of the best climate expertise funded by the government. In the government, they didn't use that climate expertise. They preferred to use McKinsey, right? So the point is not, government should do everything on its own and not ask a head teacher about, new kind of, ideas about teaching policy. It's why is it, and this kind of comes to your point about transparency, or was it one of those questions, how can we make sure, and this is what we look at in the conclusion, that the contracts hold the government accountable on what kind of advice they're even receiving, both in terms of the conflicts of interest, the both sides of the street case, which ESCOM in this country was an example of, but also in terms of knowing the full list of other types of consultees that are consulting with, but literally these is the table, the learning that will come out after that, so that it isn't just this endless kind of heroin addiction with a consultancy. So I do think that just saying it's all crap, government shouldn't have any consultants, aren't we all, isn't every academic somehow a consultant, completely misses the point, and in some ways helps the consultants. The big cons say, oh yeah, he's right, look, they're all just kind of hypocrites. I mean, it doesn't strengthen the point that much, right? If what we're talking about is a particular business model that's ridden with conflicts of interest because of the structure, the corporate governance structure, which also, as Kaya was talking about, isn't even holding them accountable because we actually don't have the same corporate governance structure in consulting as we do in the corporates.
Just some online questions. It's from Vincent Masocha. It is wrong to fully paint consultants as cons. The state does not have all the capacity. In fact,
that's the point.
Successful nations have always used consultants and strategy advisors. Godfrey Khosinyane says, in the context, this is the question I've been asking, in the context of relationships with government, can one make a link between big consulting firms and state capture or liberalizing of the state? And Mohammed, if you look at ESCOM, the transition, it is on the presidency to ask a question, talk to Meridian. If you talk to the plan on the 25th of July, it looks like a copy and paste Meridian. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. I'll be honest with you. All the reports that were done by the previous board, Boston Consulting, the Analyst, and I phoned them to ask, none of these reports have been made public after restructuring ESCOM. On the balance sheet, we had reports by Lazard, the French investment bank. it's something simple that and then we had Meridian on, there's so many of these reports that are sitting at ESCOM that nobody is doing. I don't know so I'm saying that they're also implicated in the loss of the capacity at ESCOM in terms of all these stupid proposals they make that don't make any sense, and in terms of, the restructuring, the financial, the balance sheet of ESCOM, now they're coming up with something else about how to, the conditions for the ESCOM loan say you can't borrow. So now they're trying to set up, they're hiring consultants to say, let's find a way of putting this off balance sheet. But nonsense, this thing has to be on balance, it has to be on the government balance sheet at the end of the day. So they are causing the chaos, but obviously the government is responsible. Sorry.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity to ask a question, and just congratulations, Prof, on an incredibly detailed book. I think maybe it's a function of us being at the School of Governance, where we have spoken a lot about consultancy's role in government. But I think, and this is perhaps a personal interest since I'm interested in private power as a competition regulator, if we can also just maybe touch on how consultancies also offer these image laundering services, but to the private sector. I think in the book, you cover ESG in particular as a case study of how, consultancies have been part of creating this new language of social good and businesses as a positive contributor to society without necessarily doing the work. And I think that in the South African context, where there are serious social problems and everybody wants business to come on board, there is a risk of precisely that sort of behavior, the sort of, is it greenwashing or maybe, blackwashing, if you're thinking about BE, even youth washing now in terms of how the YES employment program is structured and the role of consultants in that.
Yeah. Can I take this one and the neoliberal one? Just together, because they're kind of related. So what's interesting is that, first of all, we don't say that consultants, as I mentioned in the beginning, are the cause of the problems, but they benefit massively. They surf the wave of the shareholder value maximization wave, the downsizing waves. They came in to actually consult on that. Similarly with ESG, they didn't make up the ESG. If you look at the history of where these metrics that companies are using to show how climate driven they are for climate change, they benefit from the fact that this thing is there, they can surf on top of it, and they're absolutely then part of that kind of greenwashing, social washing, youth washing. So this is where we then have to hold governments accountable, and businesses accountable. If you're serious about showing how to align yourself around, carbon neutrality, around improving your governance structures, around improving your relationship with the different stakeholders, if you look at the talk about stakeholder value, then we need the most rigorous metrics ever, right? And the fact that they're actually being weakened by being just surfed on and greenwashed in the consulting industry again is sort of part of that, just like they were part of the neoliberal strategy. So you wouldn't say ESG is a neoliberal strategy. It's part of the, we're all in it together to fight to battle around the SDGs, but they're weakening them. So they are in fact part of the problem. They're part of the problem of not reaching those goals, but we shouldn't blame them for coming up with these kind of bogus ESG metrics. They're benefiting from that. They're not helping us actually get stronger ones for all the reasons we just talked about. But the neoliberal point, one of the stories, maybe I could just read it quickly, is, there's a connection between the recommendations and then the effect on these kind of weak states, and then the tragedies that we see globally, whether it's with COVID, where we had excess deaths. Obviously, people die in a pandemic, but what was amazing was just the very weak health systems that we found that we had globally, and they have not been strengthened, in terms of the pandemic preparedness, as new pandemics come our way, as the permafrost melts and new viruses come out and come our way. Are we more prepared this time? Did we reduce the digital divide? Did we invest in test and trace? Did we learn how to do proper outcomes orientation in our countries, but also globally to vaccinate the world? No. But in Puerto Rico, just as an example, because it's a microcosm, in 2016, Obama signed into law the Puerto Rico Oversight Management and Economic Stability Act, called PROMESA, that created an oversight board to supervise the bankruptcy process, because Puerto Rico was going bankrupt, one of these classic cases of, debts too high, so on and so forth. Following a competitive tender, McKinsey was contracted as the Oversight Board strategic consultant for the Obama administration. McKinsey's recommendations for Puerto Rico recovery concluded a roster of measures to privatize public enterprises, implement value-based reforms across the healthcare system, slash scholarships and employment terms at the University of Puerto Rico, and close down a number of different hospitals. It's not surprising, I'm just taking direct quotes from the book, that hospitals quickly and tragically reached breaking point as Hurricane Maria came about, right? So that lack of preparedness that everyone is so used to now rehearsing, that we all found ourselves so badly prepared with COVID-19, if you start looking at why, just like Kayo's examples and also your example, Mohammed, there is lots to answer for in terms of where the specificness of many of these austerity policies that then weaken public education, weakens public transport, weakens public health systems. It is impossible to strengthen those unless we really unpick these stories where this advice, the consulting is coming from, how it's being copy and pasted. Your point about copying and pasting is the point about value. It's not that the policies are wrong, because everyone makes mistakes. If we're saying governments should learn to do trial and error, well, consultants too. They're not always going to get it right. It's the copy and paste. It's that kind of PowerPoint that's being copy and pasted between Poland, Chile, Puerto Rico, just through these kind of, the words used in the question, neoliberal policies that they didn't necessarily come up with, but that have been consulted. And we see then the tragic consequences when we have a Hurricane Maria or a COVID pandemic. And there's no way we will.
Thank you very much, Mariana. An amazing presentation. It was really great to hear about, your experiences and lessons learned. And I think I've got a few. So one is really this, what, Harvard School calls like this isomorphic mimicry. We take all these policies and we copy paste them, whether it's from international experts or local experts, and we don't really understand what the context is and the environment is that we're working in. And many years ago, I was at the Treasury when we had a public-private partnership, actually one of the first ones by Siemens, as you know, pre their little, penalty on their hands for very bad behavior. But they won this digitization and IT PPP contract at the Department of Labor. And this is, 2 decades ago. And we're now part of a process, because I work at the Government Technical Advisory Center, so Duma, we do have a consulting arm for government within government, which is housed at the Treasury. But interestingly now, I sat in a workshop where the Department of Employment and Labor is in a process of restructuring. Incidentally, this has been on the table for about 2 decades. Very little has happened. But one of the questions that was asked by, I think, one of the board members is, you've got World Bank people sitting in your offices doing your ICT services. So the whole Siemens PPP contract has literally hollowed out all of the digital technology and capacity within that department, and they're now relying on external stakeholders. And, that contract was very rigid in terms of when they could do development. So, I think to me, it points out to, what you were saying early on about Ernest, is it Brackett or
Ernest Brackett.
Brackett had actually said his vision was there, right? So I suppose my question to you is really about the role of leadership, in being able to see things quite early, and what role does leadership play? And then I suppose just a second example to Mohammed's point, which is, the role of evidence, how do we use that better? And during COVID, I was part of the team that co-designed the Social Relief of Distress Grant, having come from SASSA. So just to correct Donovan, the contracts that SASSA had at the time were there before SASSA was actually established. So they were really just taken over, and SASSA was just extending them. We did have, with a lot of resistance internally, to promote banking migration, which SASSA resisted. But in the design of the SRD 350 grant, we pivoted very quickly and got Saldru at UCT to actually do some research for us to assess what the impact of a grant would be versus if we paid it to pensioners or the child support grant. And we managed to use that very quickly. So this
And you paid for that, obviously.
Well, actually, it was done pro bono for us because it was a crisis, and So it's the one example of where evidence was used, where we got public-private, partnerships together. So we had to put together a payment solution. So we actually got the Reserve Bank to pull together a whole group of experts, including Bankserv and Visa and MasterCard, etc., to actually co-design a solution for SASSA, which would start moving into contactless onboarding. It was the first time we'd actually stitched together a lot of our databases on the back end so that we could actually do automatic approvals, etc. So I suppose, we've got one example of a PPP that has failed horribly with the Department of Labor and has hamstrung that department completely. And then you've got an example of COVID where another public-private partnership has worked very well, but used an evidence-based. And I suppose my question is around the PPP stuff. It was flavor of the month 20 years ago, right? And today, a lot of our PPPs are not successful. We've actually seen a lot of failures in how they run, unless they are for large infrastructure investments and not for IT. Thank you.
Thank you. I was once involved in the PPP for the police, and we went to so many meetings, and at the end of the day I said to them, this is so complicated, why don't you just build the bloody thing? There you are, the 1, 2, and then I'll come back to the
Thank you so much. So I'm Amara Gadra. I work at a place called the Institute for Economic Justice, and my work is mainly about rethinking economics. It's aligned to the global movement, which says there is a very clear intention for privatization as efficient that, goes beyond wanting to privatize everything, because that's what my first year textbook that was written by someone that died 50 years ago tells me to do.
Thank you, Prof. I think Kaya touched on it in the beginning. I think it was a couple of weeks ago, gave a report about the state of municipalities, and she spent a lot on consultants and so much money. I think billions has been, paid to consultants. And is that difficulty that we face with local government is that have a short consultants to come in. And the issue is that top talent is not enticed to local government in particular, because we do have people at, national and provincial governments. And, one of the reasons is that it's really not safe at local governments. If you had to go there and be a CFO or SEM director, you're in real danger. So I'm interested about how then do we navigate such dynamics, because we really do need to capacitate the state, but all these challenges, such as a simple one is safety, is a barrier for us. Thanks.
Thanks. Before you think I've got a problem with you, you're next.
You're just not a girl.
It's the mic, yeah. Okay. And then the two guys at the back after you.
Oh my God, I'm never going to remember all this.
It was him and then him.
Oh, okay, sure. Yes.
Two boys.
I can assure you, Duma, we don't go to the same therapist. My name is Mpumelelo Mkhabela. I'm a political analyst and a journalist in South Africa. Quick questions. The first one is personal to Mariana. Do you consult? If you do, what are the terms of engagement? The question is, don't you think that these big con artists that we're talking about are able to perpetuate their scandals, largely because there's some prestige to be derived for using their work, and that, if not an intentional norm. So how then do we bring prestige to the public service so that the public service doesn't need validation from outside? The last question would be, what is your idea of the issue of meritocracy? I'm raising this because
issue of
meritocracy.
meritocracy.
I'm raising this because you find in a lot of agencies that are within the public service, and concomitantly the number of, or correspondingly, the number of or the extent of consultancy use also spikes. So it then doesn't make sense that you hire more people and then you use more consultancy. The budget for staff goes up, but the budget for consultants also goes up. So I just want comments on those three.
Can you just plug your book? What's it called again? My boy invited me to the launch. I couldn't come.
Oh no, it's called The Enemy Within, how the ANC lost the battle against corruption.
Thank you.
Ah.
Excellent.
Okay. Okay. I'll do this quite quickly so we can get the other ones. I mean, the asomorphic kind of hollowing out. I mean, I think, again, a lot of the comments made today are more comments and really interesting cases that we need to, as someone said before, put beef on the bone in terms of understanding what's gone wrong. And it's very interesting how you framed it, right? Kind of comes back to the good versus the bad type of relationship that the state had with the private sector. I always say that even with the vaccines, if you look at the AstraZeneca vaccine, why it was different from the Pfizer one was actually how public and private work together. The Oxford University researchers funded by the public sector, my American friends always forget, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, all private universities, Oxford and Cambridge are public universities. They received public funding and they put conditions attached to that collaboration. And they kept the costs low, the prices low, the knowledge sharing, the patent pool kind of things were at the center of that agreement. It kind of comes to the question, which I'll come to in a second in terms of what conditions should be there. But, that kind of evidence basis, I don't think the point is that the second one, oh, they did it pro bono. I mean, first of all, academics, I think 95% of what we do is pro bono. But what is kind of also the fair price, right? So if you are bringing in an expert, and there's all sorts of different experts that governments might bring in, what is the right relationship with that kind of expertise? What is the right fee so that you're not wasting money? As you said, not only is it sometimes more complicated, but it might just be cheaper to invest kind of in-house. But I think what we really need to always remember is almost all the problems we've talked about today require collective intelligence. It's never going to be solved just by the state or by the private sector. So that how to develop the contracting, the relationship, the deal. We always use the word deal, the New Deal, the Green Deal. It's the deal that often is completely problematic, and not enough thinking has been put on what does it mean to create, again, a symbiotic deal, which also strengthens that actor, and what does it mean to have that kind of evidence, come in on the right terms, if you want. But I do think, part of that microscope, not just of government agency case studies, but of relationship case studies. And believe me, the 8 vaccines were completely different, one from the other, in terms of how public and private work together and how capacity was or was not created. The question on rethink economics, thank you so much for asking, Orthodox economist. That's why I wrote The Value of Everything, looking at how so many of the problematic policies we have today were informed by very problematic economics. Neoclassical, it's all about kind of the history of neoclassical economics there, which, by the way, part of my critique to the rethinking economics movement sometimes is it has, in some parts of the world, I don't know, here, focused a bit too much also on how economics has become very formalized. It's not just about the neoclassical assumptions, too much math, so on and so forth. I'm always like, no, it's not too much math, it's the wrong math. They took the mathematics from Newtonian physics, not from biology. It was very unscientific what happened. They wanted to prove that the market system, and then following from that privatization, is the best of all possible models, that it creates Pareto optimal solutions, that there's unique equilibria. So the best math was the one that talked about centers of gravity, unique equilibria, average, prove what they wanted to prove in the first place. It's anti-scientific method. The scientific method should be, there's this crazy problem out there. We're going to throw all these different tools, types of math at it to understand it better. It wasn't that. There's a great book, by the way, which then sets government up to fail. So as soon as you start talking about collective value creation, first of all, in terms of where value is created. And that's not just about government, it's also about labor. We shouldn't forget, by the way, that we got weekends, 8-hour work, and fought for by the labor movement. Labor itself, I think, around the whole just economic transition, needs to also think about its role ex ante, not just ex post, and actually defining the transition where we want to go. But that itself needs to be thought of in terms of real stakeholder value, in terms of how we think value creation, not just redistributing it in equitable ways, right? So pre-distributive policies need a different theory of value to begin with. And the third question in terms of shortage of skills, the talent question, it's again a catch-22. I look at, and there's plenty, I'm sure, of amazing civil servants in the South African government, notwithstanding all the problems that we all know exist with the government. But when the Obama administration decided to have a proper stimulus after the financial crisis, and don't forget, the financial crisis was caused by private debt, not public debt. And yet a lot of the world ended up embarking on a massive austerity wave. In the UK, we cut everything: youth centers, public libraries, mental health, public health, and so on, blaming kind of government using its debt as the shortage of skill to steer the direction towards green. This is where the Tea Party came in and said, no, you can't do it.